Welcome. Today we are visiting the Ararat Cemetery in Victoria's Central Highlands to visit the final resting place of Janet Dunn. Now, Janet was a child convict from Scotland who was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1840 for the crime of stealing a book. She was 12 years old. In 1839, Janet was recorded as working as a nurse. At such a young age, it's unclear what that role truly entailed. The word child is crossed out in the records. Does this suggest she was employed as a nanny or nursemaid? Probably. Janet was the daughter of Elizabeth Dunn, a widow living on King Street in Glasgow. Whether Janet remained at home with her mother or was placed in service elsewhere is unknown. A report from the Greenock Advertiser in September 1839 described Janet, despite her age, as an old thief. This raises questions about her circumstances. Was she stealing to survive or possibly to support her mother? It's possible given the social conditions at the time. The article goes on to detail that Janet, along with Rosanna McLaughlin and John Maitland, were accused of stealing a book from a shop in Cowcaddens the previous August. Both Janet and Rosanna were also charged as habit and repute thieves, a term in Scottish law used to describe individuals who were not only repeat offenders but also widely recognised in their communities as habitual thieves. Janet had already served 2 months in prison for stealing a single handkerchief, and she'd been charged 3 other times for offences she couldn't remember. She was sentenced to 7 years transportation, meaning as a child she would never see her mother again. Can you imagine? Janet was tiny. She was 3 foot 11 and a quarter inches. And she was pale with light hair and light hazel eyes, and she had 2 scars on the right side of her mouth. Her jail report described her as bad, simply because she had previous convictions. Janet was taken down to Woolwich on the banks of the River Thames and placed aboard the transportation ship the Gilbert Henderson. The ship departed in December and arrived in Van Diemen's Land in April 1840. In 1866, an article titled "Life on Board a Female Convict Ship" appeared in the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine. It was written by an anonymous midshipman who travelled as a passenger aboard the vessel. So, what a treat. We have a first-hand eyewitness of the ship that Janet sailed on and what happened. So, and he wrote, "In the year 1840, I sailed from Woolwich on board the barque Gilbert Henderson of Liverpool, chartered as a convict ship by government and bound to Hobart Town, Van Diemen's Land, with a living freight of 350 female convicts. Beside the naval surgeon, in our case one Sir John Hammett, the passengers on board the Gilbert Henderson comprised a retired naval physician of the fleet who was going out to settle in Van Diemen's Land." I'll skip a little bit here because it does go on a bit. There was also a nephew, a young Irishman about 20 years age, of no profession, who was under his uncle's patronage, a lad of 15 years, a retired army captain greatly addicted to microscopic studies, and a midshipman of the Royal Navy, myself, going out to rejoin my ship after having been sick on furlough. So the Gilbert Henderson sailed in due course from Woolwich, and as we had tolerably fine weather, the horrors of seasickness were all got over before we had well got clear of the British Channel. The punishments were few and far from severe, and as a general rule, after the first month at sea was seldom called for. Stopping the allowance of tea at supper time or the allowance of plum pudding on Sundays and Thursdays were the mildest and the most frequent punishments. Next to these was the sending of the culprit below in fine weather and compelling her to work while her companions were enjoying themselves on deck. For the more refractory, a wooden box, something like a sentry box, was provided. The culprit was placed in this box, where she was compelled either to stand upright or to stoop in an uneasy posture for an hour or two, or 3, according to the nature of the offence. The severest punishment of all, or that which was regarded as the most severe, was the cropping of the head. I believe there was not a female on board, old or young, who would not almost as soon have lost her life as have had her hair cut close. It not only deprived them of their most cherished natural ornament, but it branded them as infamous on their arrival in the colony and rendered them objects of ridicule and derision. On one occasion only was it enforced, and then the culprit was a young, good-looking and generally well-behaved girl with a head of luxuriant black hair. She pleaded, as if for her life, that the punishment might be spared, and her companions pleaded for her, but the offence of which she had been guilty was one that could not be overlooked, or that, if overlooked, would have struck a fatal blow to the discipline of the ship. The doctor, however, permitted the offence to be condoned by merely going through the form of the punishment, and one of the women simply clipped off 1/4 inch from the culprit's back hair. Oh, thank goodness for that. I wonder what she did. The girl was afterwards, as she had been before, one of the best behaved of all on board. It is hard to say what she might have become if the really kind-hearted doctor had proved stern and submitted her to the dreaded degradation. And here we have the Chinese section of the cemetery. Now, back in the gold days, lots of Chinese came through from Robe, from South Australia, and they all walked to the goldfields, and many of them made it to Ararat and found a lot of gold. And here is the section of the cemetery where many of them lie today. And I think the Ararat Cemetery have done a fantastic job at preserving the graves. And I believe the Friends of sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Gumsan, they could have even been the Chinese miners' descendants. I'm actually not sure, but if you know more, please leave comments so that we can all learn. So they've done a great job of preserving the Chinese part of the Ararat Cemetery. Now, the Ararat Cemetery is actually a really lovely cemetery and well worth a visit if you are in the area. Okay, so let's return to the Gilbert Henderson. So the midshipman continues to write, the women's position on board enabled the officers to exercise a much greater amount of moral and physical control over them than they could have exercised over free immigrants. And though many of the convicts were of the vilest class, as was manifest both from their appearance, and their conduct during the early part of the passage, such was not the case, at least to all appearance, with the great majority. That's kind of high praise, isn't it? At the period of which I write, females were still much needed in Australia and Van Diemen's Land, and perhaps for this reason, perhaps also because the penal laws of late years have been much more mildly administrated, the greater number of females on board were sent abroad for terms varying from 7 to 14 years, for offences that would nowadays be condoned by a few months or weeks' confinement in the penitentiary. Most of the convicts were young women, many mere girls, and I believe that shoplifting, and that for the first time, according to their own account, and indeed according to the prison sheet, was the offence of which the greater number had been convicted. I find that infuriating. These women and girls were given harsher sentences than usual, not because of the severity of their crimes, but because the colony needed females. They were treated as little more than breeding stock, while their descendants may have benefited in the long run, so you and me, We must ask at what cost to them. The suffering endured by so many women and girls, the founders of our nation, was profound and deeply unjust. So our anonymous man continues, strange to say, among so many females of a generally degraded class, illness or even serious indisposition was very rare. So our midshipman's prejudice is showing here. Surprise, surprise. He goes on, few in fact were indisposed in the slightest degree after the malady of seasickness had disappeared from amongst them. He says even when the weather was rainy or boisterous, all were on deck for at least an hour or two in the course of the day, being sent up at such times in squads or parties of 40 or 50 at a time. There was in fact but one case of serious illness during the voyage, and that resulted in death. Just when the ship had reached the equator, a poor girl of 18 years of age, who ought never to have been sent on board at all, died of consumption. The young midshipman described the burial of a young woman named Mary Connor. So a quantity of coarse stuff suitable for rough needlework was supplied by government, as well as a great number of tracts and religious, as well as instructive and amusing books. It is fascinating to gain this insight into life on board a female convict transportation ship. However, we must keep in mind that the account is written by a free man, and therefore reflects his perspective, assumptions and potential biases. His observations, while valuable, may not fully capture the lived experiences of the woman on board. He goes on, as a general rule, these women, after they got over their seasickness and had become familiar with the routine of the ship, appeared to be quite contented and happy. In a few instances in which the convicts had fallen from a respectable position in life and had received a good education and had perhaps been used in early girlhood to mingle with troops of friends and to mix in good society, and there were some on board, they seemed deeply to feel their degradation and held themselves as much as possible aloof from their companions in shame. But even such as these were not always unhappy, at least in seeming. Hope springs eternal in the human breast, and perhaps they hope yet to outlive their past disgrace and to become respectable and even respected members of society in the land of their enforced exile. At length, the lofty, sombre mountains of Tasmania hove in sight, and the next day the Gilbert Henderson came to an anchor in the harbour of Hobart Town, and was immediately boarded by the custom house officers and others of the colonial authorities. The superintendent of convicts came on board, and one after another each female was summoned before him and requested to state her name and age and the place of her birth if she knew it, and also the occupation she had followed in England, Ireland or Scotland. She was likewise requested to say whether she could read or write, or neither or both, and whether she had any marks on her arms or other parts of her person, and if on her arms to show them, otherwise to describe them. She was then told that she must in future, while under the control of the government authorities, answer to a number attached to her Christian name, and informed that her future treatment would depend entirely upon her own conduct in the colony. The past was forgotten. Then the women were told to state boldly once and for all whether they had any complaint to make of the conduct of the doctor, the captain, the officers or crew. To this there was a general cry of "None! None! None!" amid a general clapping of hands, until the officer had to call for and insist upon silence. A few hours after the Gilbert Henderson had come to anchor and the officials had quitted the ship, the state barge of His Excellency the Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land was seen approaching. It contained Sir John Franklin, then Lieutenant Governor of Diemen's Land, and Lady Franklin, who were attended by a guard of honour in the colonial uniform of blue and silver. Sir John Franklin wore the uniform of a post-captain of the Royal Navy, and he and his lady had reached the ship before we had time to fire a salute. or make any preparations to receive them. I was informed that Sir John Franklin made it a point to visit every convict ship that arrived at Hobart Town, and Lady Franklin always accompanied him on board female convict ships. And it says, while Sir John inquired with the men, Lady Franklin, meanwhile, with a gentle sympathy and a natural kindness which at once attracted them towards her, sought out the younger convicts, so this would have been Janet, and assembled them around her and addressed them briefly yet earnestly, telling them that if now they behaved well and were honest, virtuous and diligent, their past follies and crimes would be forgotten, and they might yet become happy wives and mothers and respectable and respected members of society. Janet was taken to the female factory in Hobart. Unlike some of the other women, she wasn't placed directly into service, likely because she was only 12 years old. The authorities would have wanted to observe, train and assess her behaviour and level of maturity before assigning her to a household. At that time, there were no child labour laws, so even children as young as Janet could be expected to work once deemed ready. 8 months later, she was recorded as being assigned to the Swan family in Newtown. 2 years later, Janet was granted a ticket of leave, which allowed her to work for herself and earn a wage. Unfortunately, in February 1844, Janet was charged with larceny under £5, and she received quite a harsh punishment. Her existing transportation sentence of 7 years was extended by 12 months, and her ticket of leave was revoked. She was given 4 months probation back at the Cascades female factory, and being sent back into probation was both a punishment and a reset. Her behaviour was reassessed and she was placed under stricter supervision and assigned tasks within the factory, such as laundry work or sewing. The return to probation signalled a loss of trust and a delay in her path toward conditional freedom. For many girls, especially those still in their teens, it was a harsh reminder of the rigid expectations placed on them and the limited control they had over their futures. Janet was now 16 years old. After completing her 4 months probation, Janet obtained a probation pass. Now, a probation pass allowed a female convict to be hired out for work, typically as a domestic servant or in other labour roles. And after completing a period of penal labour and demonstrating good behaviour, she found work as a domestic servant for an E. Chapman of Hobart. It was likely around this time that she met fellow Glaswegian Archibald Bogle. Just 2 months later, the pair were granted permission to marry, and Janet's ticket of leave was restored. Archie had worked as a butcher's boy before being transported for 7 years at the age of 18. Convicted of theft by housebreaking, he arrived in Van Diemen's Land aboard the Egyptian in 1839. Archibald was also classified as a habit and repute thief with a prior conviction on his record. The pair were married 2 months later at St Andrew's Church in Hobart by the Reverend Little, and around the same time Janet found work with a Christiana Fairbairn of Patrick Street. And it seems though that arrangement didn't work out, because just 2 months later she was working for a John Baker of 84 Murray Street in Hobart, which I do believe was or is the King's Arms pub. And this placement was also short-lived, perhaps fortunately for Janet. And within a month, she was working for a Maria Osborne of Liverpool Street. Now, it's unclear what Archibald was doing during this period, though he was likely working as a butcher, as noted on their marriage certificate. It is very disturbing then to discover that in December of 1845, Janet is charged with misconduct for being in a common brothel at 11 p.m. at night. Just what was going on? Was Janet working there? Or was she possibly visiting a friend? I like to think she was visiting a friend and assisting her to escape the brothel. Please. She was sentenced to 2 months of hard labour at the Cascades Female Factory, and her ticket of leave was revoked once again. Now, upon her release from the factory in November, Janet's ticket of leave was reinstated, and fortunately she remained out of trouble and was freed by servitude in September 1847. She also received her certificate of freedom later that same month. Two years later, Janet gave birth to her first child in Hobart, a son named Archibald. The boy was known as Archibald Mackenzie, suggesting that his father had adopted the surname Mackenzie, possibly to distance himself from his convict past and improve his chances of finding employment. Having also gained his freedom, he would have needed to secure work. From that point on, the entire family, including Janet, used the name Bogle Mackenzie, or just Mackenzie. We can trace the family's movements through the births of their 3 children. Young Archie Jr. was born in Hobart in 1847, followed 2 years later by his sister Elizabeth Janet Mackenzie, who was born in Melbourne. Now, it's notable that Janet named her first daughter after her mother. Now, there are 3 unclaimed letter records for Archie at the Melbourne General Post Office from 1855 through to 1857, and I believe the family had already set off for the Browns' diggings in search of their fortune. It was there in 1858 that Janet gave birth to her 3rd and final child, a son named Joseph. Now, Brown's diggings was part of the broader Victorian gold rush, which began in the early 1850s and attracted thousands of prospectors and families from across Australia and the world. By the mid-1850s, the area around Scarsdale, near Ballarat, was booming, with gold found in gullies and tributaries of the Woody Yallock Creek. Now, it's at this point that the family's circumstances took a grim turn. In August 1871, young Elizabeth, now aged 22 and unmarried, was admitted to Geelong Hospital with a diagnosis of womb cancer. Just 3 months later, her mother Janet was admitted to the Ararat Lunatic Asylum, suffering from mania. Janet's admission records distressingly noted that she had no known relatives or friends. This raises so many questions. Why was Janet admitted with no known family? Where was Archibald Sr. and Jr.? Archibald Jr. was now 24 years old, and I can find no trace of him in any records. If you have more information, please let us know in the comments. Elizabeth remained in hospital until her death 6 months later. She never left the Geelong Hospital following her admission. In October 1872, Janet's husband Archibald appeared before the Williamstown Petty Sessions, charged with failing to pay maintenance for his son Joseph. 13-year-old Joseph had been placed in the Williamstown Reformatory School, an institution for boys considered delinquent or neglected. With Janet institutionalised and Elizabeth gravely ill and now dead, did Archibald have no choice but to place his son into care? Probably. Care might be a stretch to what poor Joseph probably endured. In response to the 1864 Neglected and Criminal Children's Act, Victoria established 2 types of institutions: industrial schools for neglected children and reformatory schools for those convicted of crimes. Neglect was broadly defined, including situations where children were homeless, begging, living with criminals, or deemed uncontrollable by their parents. Courts could choose to send convicted children to industrial schools based on their age and personal circumstances. Both types of schools aimed to provide basic education and vocational training. Children, some as young as 8, were expected to contribute to daily work such as cooking, laundry, tailoring, farming and other trades. Boys placed on the training ship Nelson or the reformatory vessel Sir Harry Smith received instruction in seamanship to prepare them for maritime careers. The good news is Joseph survived and went on to marry and have children. One of them he named Archibald Bogle, after his father, which is an indication perhaps that he felt no ill will towards his father for placing him in an institution. Archibald Sr. spent much of his later life in and out of the Williamstown petty sessions. In November 1877 he was fined 20 shillings for assaulting a man named Charlie Smith. More than a decade later, in December 1889, he was charged with being drunk while in charge of a horse. Just 6 months after that, he was again brought before the court for being drunk and disorderly in a public place. There were also several cases involving unpaid rent. By this time, Archibald was in his late 60s and early 70s, and it's clear that money was tight. He obviously struggled with alcohol as well. Archibald died in Williamstown in 1900. And he is buried at the Williamstown Cemetery. He was interred in a grave with 9 other people, most likely a pauper's burial. Janet remained in the Ararat Lunatic Asylum, later known as the Aradale Asylum or just Aradale, for 10 years, until her death in March 1881. But what exactly was mania in 1872? In that era, mania was a broad and often misunderstood psychiatric diagnosis used in Victorian asylums. It typically referred to a state of heightened mental disturbance, which could include symptoms such as extreme agitation, delusions, or erratic behaviour. However, the term was applied loosely and often without the nuanced understanding that we have today. Women in the 19th century were institutionalised for a wide range of reasons, many of which would now be recognised as normal emotional responses or treatable mental health conditions. These included postnatal depression, grief and bereavement, anxiety and stress, overwork or exhaustion, infidelity or perceived moral failings, which was called moral insanity, epilepsy or other neurological conditions, and nonconformity or eccentric behaviour. The diagnosis of mania could be triggered by any behaviour that deviated from societal expectations of femininity, obedience, and domesticity. A woman expressing anger, rejecting religious norms, or showing signs of independence might be labelled as manic or insane. Was Janet overwhelmed by stress and grief over her daughter's illness, or had she been suffering long-term from the trauma of her past as a child convict in colonial Australia, banished from her homeland and her mother? Combined with the emotional toll of motherhood and societal pressures, living on the goldfields, probably in a tent, probably poor, everything simply became too much to bear, or had everything simply become too much to bear. Honestly, back then it could have been anything. The history of Ararat Asylum is vast and complex, spanning from its opening in 1867 until its closure in the late 20th century. This video only scratches the surface of the many stories and sufferings that unfolded within its walls. The institution's legacy deserves deeper exploration, and what is shared here is just a glimpse into a much larger and often confronting narrative. Ararat Lunatic Asylum, established in 1848, was the first purpose-built asylum for the mentally ill in Victoria. According to author Graham Burgeon, who wrote The Building, Aradale, Ararat Lunatic Asylum, Volume 1, The 19th Century, Authorities quickly concluded that Yarra Bend was unsuitable. This was largely due to the fact that most of its buildings were constructed from timber and did not adhere to the architectural standards of the latest institutions in England. After 1851, when thousands of people flooded into Victoria during the gold rush, the demand for asylums grew rapidly. Plans were made to establish facilities in Kew, Beechworth and Ararat. These were designed in the barracks style, modelled on the Colonial Asylum in Middlesex in England. Patients lived in large dormitory-style rooms, much like soldiers. Newspapers reported the official opening of the asylum on the 19th of October 1867. Originally constructed to accommodate 250 patients, it quickly exceeded that capacity. Graham Burgeon notes, many Chinese gold diggers also ended up in the asylum, and a Chinese interpreter had to be sought. Naturally, male and female patients were housed separately, and in the early days even staff were prohibited from interacting with members of the opposite sex. It is therefore concerning that a woman named Mary Coleman, admitted to Ararat Asylum on its opening day after being transferred from the Yarra Bend Asylum, gave birth to a child within the institution in June 1870. This disturbing event was reported in the newspapers, including an article published in the Leader on Saturday the 11th of March 1871. It read, "The Ararat Advertiser narrates a story to the effect that a female patient of the local lunatic asylum, a woman, was in June last confined of a child, the paternity of which is unknown. Such an occurrence is a foul blot upon an institution to which poor demented women are consigned in the expectation that humane treatment and medical skill may restore their shattered intellect. It would be monstrous if such a thing had occurred in any private establishment, and public opinion would at once have insisted upon the asylum being closed. But for female lunatics in a government establishment where the surveillance should be of the most rigid character to be seduced and no one to be held accountable for the foul act is utterly incomprehensible. It seems probable indeed that the public would never have heard anything of the matter but for the difficulty there was of disposing of the child. This difficulty was got over by the surgeon of the asylum making formal application to the local bench to have the infant sent to the industrial school, which request, it seems, has been complied with. Dr. Robinson declares that all attempts to discover the paternity of the infant have been in vain. Who is the responsible head of the Ararat Lunatic Asylum? There is the place where the government must demand a full explanation of this shameful affair. It is impossible to accept Dr. Robinson's statement that inquiry has been made in vain. The government owe a duty to society which constitutes it the guardian of poor women of disordered intellect, and unless the person can be produced who committed this foul wrong, every office in the Ararat or Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum, when the locality of the offence is fixed, should be vacated as a guarantee that this will never ever happen again." The following information has been supplied to us by a correspondent at Ararat. Mary Coleman's case was reported to and investigated by the government some months before the child was born. It was supposed that a convalescent patient, who has since been discharged, got possession of a key and by this means obtained access to the officers' quarters where the girl, she was 30 years old, was employed. The girl states that the patient referred to was the father of the child, and although the male patient denied it, there was good reason for believing that the girl's statement was correct. At the same time as she herself is of unsound mind, it would be manifestly unsafe to make her statement the basis of a positive assertion in a court of justice. The explanation must go for what is it worth. To us, it seems to make matters worse than before. The minister at the head of the department, who could be satisfied with such an explanation, must be a very easygoing man, and it need not occasion surprise if, after such an explanation was accepted, similar events were to occur. We should have thought that some reason would have been asked why lunatic women were employed in the officers' quarters, and an order issued preventing such for the future. Our correspondent does not say whether this was done or not. A further article in the Ararat and Mount Pleasant Creek Advertiser and Chronicle for the District of Wimmera on the 3rd of March 1871 reported, a nameless child whose mother named Mary Coleman was admitted into the Ararat Asylum on the 19th of October 1867, having been transferred from the Yarrabend Asylum, was brought before the police magistrate for the purpose of being sent to the industrial school. Dr. Robertson, the superintendent of the asylum, stated that the child was born at the asylum on the 11th of June 1870. The mother was a patient about 30 years of age. The child had not been baptised, but the CPS called his name John, and as John Coleman, the child sent to the industrial school for 7 years. The paternity of the child is a mystery, which the authorities at the asylum have not been able to penetrate. Oh, I hope that John has descendants who might one day be able to take a DNA test to help solve the mystery. It is interesting to note that the authorities didn't suspect that it could be an official, well, not officially anyway, if you know what I mean. A patient was to blame. Poor Mary, goodness knows what was going on. Can you imagine the stress of pregnancy and childbirth in such an environment, and then to have her child taken from her? The suffering she must have endured is terrible. Now here's just some footage I took, whoa, we're all getting dizzy there, sorry. Just some footage I took outside of the asylum. We did go there and we were an hour late for the tour, so we missed out. I totally read the website wrong, so it was very disappointing. They do actually run a 2.5 hour tour on Sunday mornings and I think Saturday as well, but we missed that. Hopefully we'll be able to go back again. So the Ararat Asylum was designed to function as a self-sufficient community. It featured its own agricultural facilities, including gardens, orchards, vineyards and livestock areas. The site also housed grim elements such as execution facilities, a morgue and a cemetery. Comprising 63 buildings, the complex was enclosed by distinctive ha-ha walls, a clever architectural feature used in Victorian-era institutions. These walls appeared low and non-threatening from the outside, but concealed deep trenches on the inner side to prevent escape, subtly maintaining confinement without the appearance of imprisonment. Janet lived within the asylum for 10 years before her death at 54 years of age on the 24th of March 1881, with the recorded cause being exhaustion from disease of the brain. Now in 1881, a recorded cause of death, such as exhaustion from disease of the brain, reflected the limited medical understanding and terminology of the time. The phrase likely referred to a prolonged mental illness, possibly what we might now recognise as a form of severe psychiatric disorder such as schizophrenia, dementia, or a neurological condition like epilepsy or encephalitis. Exhaustion in this context often implied physical decline or wasting away due to the mental condition, and the disease of the brain was a broad term used to describe a range of mental or neurological illnesses. It suggests the person may have suffered for a long time with their mental and physical health deteriorating until death. So poor Janet. I truly hope she was treated with kindness and dignity. Now, unfortunately, so we tried to get all around the asylum, but unfortunately, just up ahead, the road was closed. So we couldn't get, I think this was all as far as we could go. So I think it may have been quite a stunning place back in the day. Well, at least visually anyway. Now, just to note, the next 5 images that you will see, I actually took photos of photos that they had at the information centre at J Ward at the Ararat Jail. And I believe they are photos of inside the asylum. Okay, so while researching for this video, I came across a number of disturbing articles about the treatment of patients in the asylum. One newspaper article described a 40-year-old woman from Ballarat who, after her release, wrote to the paper to complain about the conduct of some of the female warders. These incidences likely occurred while Janet was still alive and dependent on the very same carers. So that's why I thought I'd just add this story in, because it may indicate what Janet had to endure. And look, we don't really know, so it may not. I just really hope for Janet's sake that, like I said, she was treated with kindness and dignity. And look, I'm sure she was. at times. Now, this letter was in the Geelong Advertiser on Wednesday, the 6th of June, 1883, on page 4. So a married woman, 40 years of age, recently discharged from the Ararat Lunatic Asylum, writes to the Ballarat Star, exonerating the matron and medical superintendent, whom she refers to as being as kind as could be expected, but charging some of the female warders in the refractory ward with drunkenness and cruelty. She avers that inmates failing to rise punctually in the morning have been dragged out of bed by the hair or ears. The bath, she states, to have been the chief place for the exercise of ill treatment. Towel racks and bunches of keys being used for purposes of punishment. To quote her own words, "They have drawn rivers of blood from me, and my body is covered with bruises caused by the blows from these weapons." She alleges that a patient, after being ill-treated, was removed by the attendants into some place of seclusion. Another allegation is that the allowances of brandy and eggs for patients are in a wholesale manner converted by the attendants to their own use. In her own case, during over nearly 3 years, she received brandy and sago on 5 occasions during the first fortnight and eggs during the last week of her confinement. In the interim, she received none of these articles, although her husband had been repeatedly informed that they were included in her diet. Of about £5 worth of clothing, which was sent to her by relatives, she brought nothing away. The food was sent in badly cooked and served in a dirty manner. Another serious statement is that patients were frequently administered inordinately large doses of salts to weaken them, and so render them less troublesome to manage. In the event of a patient refusing to take food, 2 or 3 of the attendants would gather round, and while one held the nose of the patient, the others would force the food down her throat. She alleges that one patient died from the effects of the ill treatment during the forcing process. The bowl of the spoon was rammed so far down the gullet that the spoon had to be forcibly withdrawn, and the withdrawal was followed by a terrible gush of blood. Oh dear. The reason assigned for the ill treatment and the fact of its not having previously come to light is that the majority of female inmates are the wives of labourers whose husbands have perhaps drifted away, not caring what is the fate of their unhappy spouses. Mr. Berry has referred the foregoing charges to Dr. Dick, Inspector General of Asylums, for report. And sadly, Janet was in that category, her husband living a long way away in Williamstown. Now, Janet is buried here in the Ararat Cemetery. Now, I believe all of this area is where a lot of the patients from the Ararat Asylum are buried. And Janet is buried in a Roman Catholic grave. It is in the Roman Catholic section, in grave 323. And there she is. Janet Dunn's life was shaped by poverty, punishment, resilience, and silence. From her conviction at age 12 for stealing a book to her years of forced labour, institutionalisation, and family fragmentation, her story reflects the brutal realities faced by many women in the convict system. Her suffering was not unique, but it was profound, and it mattered. Her final decades spent in the Ararat Lunatic Asylum was marked by isolation and a diagnosis of mania, a term that in 19th century Victoria could encompass anything from grief and trauma to simple non-conformity. Janet's admission, with no known relatives or friends, is a heartbreaking reminder of how easily women could be forgotten, even by those closest to them. The asylum where she spent her final years was meant to be a place of care, but the historical records tells a more troubling story. Reports of abuse, neglect, and institutional cruelty, like the case of Mary Coleman, who gave birth within the asylum under mysterious and disturbing circumstances, and the testimony of a former patient who described physical violence and deprivation. It reveals a system that often failed the very people it was meant to protect. That Janet lived and died in such a place, dependent on the same carers later, accused of cruelty, is a sobering thought. and yet her legacy endures. Her son Joseph survived, married and named one of his children Archibald Bogle, perhaps a gesture of forgiveness or simply a way to honour family ties. Janet's descendants, like so many others, are a part of the fabric of modern Australia, woven from stories of hardship, endurance and quiet strength. And as we stand at her grave in Ararat Cemetery, we remember Janet not as a criminal, but as a child of Glasgow, a survivor of the convict system, a mother and a woman whose life deserves to be known. Her story is a testament to the resilience of those who endured the foundations of our colonial past, and a call to remember them with compassion, truth and care. Janet's story reminds us that behind every name in the records is a life, complex, painful and worthy of remembrance, a part of our extraordinary convict history.